Hello, I'm Fel the Blythe, podcast editor, historical interpreter, and Hellenic polytheist. I actually recorded this part of this video a few days ago, but that was a complete disaster. So I'm just gonna redo it. So this video is about cleanliness and purification. So I went over a little bit about the different types of pollution in my first video.
Things that are offensive to the gods. Things that are impure. Things like lima, miasma, and agos.
However, I'm not going to be getting really into the nitty-gritty details of what pollution is in this video. Even I know it sounds kind of counterintuitive to talk about purification and not talk about pollution, but really pollution, there's been whole books dedicated to the subject of what pollution is what and the differences, and honestly in antiquity, literature is really not consistent in terms of definitions. You don't really need to worry about like doing more intense forms of purification. Most people are going to be dealing with lima or limana, which translates to things that is washed away. Most people are going to be dealing with that primarily, so that's another reason why I'm not getting into the definitions here, because I don't think you're going to be incurring divine anger or committing like a bunch of taboos. We're not going to worry about that. Cleanliness and purification were done for three main reasons. Number one is to separate the mundane from the sacred. Number two is to make yourself presentable and to return yourself to the state of cleanliness in order to approach the gods. And number three is to organize people into groups. One of the interesting things I discovered during my research for this video was that cleanliness and purification were often seen as a rite de séparation, rite of separation. You were cleaning yourself in order to mark the boundary between where the profound and the profane began. So here's a quote from a companion to Greek religion by Daniel Ogden. Contrary to what is usually claimed, the opposite of pollution is not purity. The opposite is normality. Whenever they access the realm of the sacred, which is said to be pure, and whenever they return from a state of pollution to their ordinary lives, religion requires purification of them. By dressing in clean clothes or putting on a veil, or by doing a certain act of purification, you are marking to yourself and to those around you that you are ready to enter a state of a ritual. It's kind of like to begin and to end something. It's a marker of transition. So the second reason I mentioned is to return ourselves to a state of cleanliness in which we are ready to approach the gods. Now, the return to a state of cleanliness is the important distinction here, and why lima and other forms of pollution are not comparable to the Christian idea of sin. So sin, the idea of sin is that sin is inherent. Because you were born a human, you are born sinful. This is not the case with lima and other forms of pollution. Lima is something, specifically lima is something that you get from the world around you. It's just sort of general spiritual dirtiness, just from living in an imperfect world. And miasma is usually something that you've done, usually, though not always. And when you perform an act of cleanliness or purification, you are returning to your natural state, and your natural state is cleanliness. Here's an interesting quote from Miasma, Pollution and Purification in Early Greek Religion by Robert Parker. The distinction, however, is not absolute, as sacred, not sacred, polluted are points upon a continuous line. It's not always like impure versus you are pure. It's a continuous line, as I stated, which is why purification and cleanliness are not needed like constantly all the time. It's sort of in flux. The third reason that I mentioned is that cleanliness and purification helps organize people into groups. So here's a quote from Greek Religion by Walter Burkert, which I mention in like every video. That should give you a hint that it's like pretty good and you should check it out. Most libraries have it. To belong to a group is to conform to their standards of purity. Now, this is not a philosophical consideration. This is pretty much like a fact. If I were to go about my 21st century life living to 18th century standards of purity, I'd probably get some weird looks. This is not to say that people in the 18th century were gross and nasty. That doesn't make sense from a human standpoint. Nastiness and uncleanliness breeds disease. Why would they do that purposely? They weren't dirty. They just had a different standard and a different set of rules than we did. And in fact, there are things that we do today that we consider cleanliness that actually actively harm our bodies and make us dirtier. So thus we see purification and cleanliness as a communal manner. There's countless times in literature where we see one unclean individual pollutes and poisons a whole city. This is the inciting incident in Oedipus Rex. I feel like I talk about Oedipus for some reason in like every video recently. I don't know, Freud would have a field day with that. Crops are failing, people are dying, and Oedipus sends someone to the Oracle of Delphi to inquire what's wrong. And Apollo sends back, basically being like, hey, there's a dude who did some very terrible things that you need to get rid of, and once you get rid of him, the fate that is befalling your city will cease. So Oedipus is like enraged and like sets out on a search for this man, and then lo and behold, it turns out to be him. And thus he banishes himself, he goes into a self-exile, and the effects of the pollution stop. And then we sort of get into kind of the elements I talked about in my last video. I kind of talked about Oedipus, the end of Oedipus' story, then and now the beginning, but whatever. Next I'm going to dive into more in-depth, like historical considerations, like what we can actually see in history that is being done in terms of how cleanliness and how purification are sought out, and not just like the why. But first, I'm going to give you some more philosophy for something that I'm not going to elaborate on, but I'm going to let you think about as you watch this video. This is, again, from Miasma, Pollution and Purification in Early Greek Religion by Robert Parker. Here it comes. The gods ruled the universe because they were powerful and immortal, not because they were pure. It was in practical rather than in theological terms that divine purity became an important conception. Sacredness is elusive, irreducibly metaphysical. Purity, though also metaphysical, can at least be expressed symbolically in concrete terms. Cleanliness is, in fact, not a special preparation for worship, but a requirement for formal, respectful behavior of any kind. There is no genetic difference between the lustrations that precede a prayer and those that precede a meal. Historical considerations. My favorite part. Actually, they're all my favorite part. I don't know why I would make a video. I didn't enjoy every part of it. It's impossible to read any contemporaneous literature without seeing people wash their hands like constantly. As far back as we can trace Hellenic literature, we can find evidence for cleanliness and purification, and this goes beyond Hellenism. Like most, if not all, ancient religions have cleanliness and purification rituals. I'm going to give you some quotes on Hesiod-ish. The identity of if Hesiod really wrote Works and Days is, we don't think so. And then also Homer, who I guess is also an ish because we don't know who Homer was. Waters are sacred, so never wade into the eternally flowing water of a lovely river to make a journey until you have prayed first. Gaze into the lovely stream as you pray, then wash your hands in the beautiful clear water. He who does not purify himself with his gesture crosses a river wicked and unclean. Never pour your morning libation of sparkling wine to Zeus if you have not first purified the hand that pours it. All the other immortal gods will also take offense. All the gods spit a man's impious prayer right back at him. Both of those are from Works and Days by Hesiod, translated by C.S. Morrissey. We can see this in Homer as well. This is from the Iliad. And with hands unwashed, I would take shame to pour the glittering wine to Zeus. There is no means for a man to pray to the dark-misted son of Kronos with blood and muck all splattered upon him. Additionally, in Homer, besides the act of washing your hands, we see purification, cleanliness being shown with changing into pure clothes, casting off scourings into the sea, and bathing. So how was this achieved in classical times? Remember, Homer is the Bronze Age. People conflate the Bronze Age and the classical period, but they are not the same, in fact. This is a little bit of a matter of debate in terms of how it was achieved in the classical period versus the Bronze Age. But first, I would like to point out that there is a massive difference from polis to polis in terms of purification and cleanliness, expectations, and even from temple to temple. The primary way cleanliness and purification was achieved, though, was through washing. The simplest form of it is just washing your hands in some sort of clean water. Maybe sprinkling it over your face or over yourself and in the area around you. And take some issue with the way that they are talked about today because it is not really precedented all that much. But save that debate for a little bit later. In addition to washing your hands, we also see the bathing of statues with seawaters from springs or rivers, as well as ritual baths. So water, I mean, it's a great literal cleanser, so it's also seen as a spiritual cleanser. Another form of purification that we see is fumigation. So quite literally, by getting rid of bad smells, you're also purifying the area from any sort of spiritual pollution. We see this in the Odyssey when Odysseus comes home, kills the suitors, and then after he gets rid of their body, he promptly burns sulfur to purify the house. Now, do not do this. I cannot repeat enough. Do not burn sulfur. Do not do it. No. In this way, fire is seen as purifying. It consumes and it transforms. So things that are ugly or things that are disgusting are tossed into a fire and then transformed into ash, and then they are cast away. Fire itself can be purifying, as well as the smoke. Another form of cleanliness and purification was a simple act of changing clothes. change. Usually they were white robes because they're undyed, and they're also really hard to maintain. So by changing into white clothes, you were signifying this is important, because keeping your clothes white in that time period, kind of even like today, is relatively unachievable. So by making a point of changing into white clothes, you were really like doing that rite of separation that I talked about earlier. Another interesting way, you know, the word scapegoat, this idea of someone taking the fall for something someone else did, that has its roots in Hellenism. So the idea of scapegoats originally was that you would transfer your pollution onto something, usually an animal, but could be an object, it could even be a person, and then that thing is cast out, killed, destroyed, or exiled in some way. For example, in the Thargelia, which is a big, massive purification ritual, primarily to Apollo. There's other deities involved, but it's primarily Apollo as a averter of evil. 2 people would be selected, one for the men, one for the women, and they would be paraded around the city as scapegoats, and then they would be exiled. Now, it's unclear whether or not they were allowed back in. They would be a very extreme form of scapegoat, so by casting them out on the Thargelia, you're sending out all of the city's pollution and evil with them. One of the best ways to be clean and pure is to protect yourself from impurity. This was usually seen in the act of covering or binding your hair, binding just meaning braiding or tying with a string. This is why some Hellenic polytheists veil or bind their hair. Now, I don't do it all the time. I mostly did it just for this video. I usually do it ritually for like very specific rituals, or if there's a lot of icky things kind of happening in the area that I'm in. Like sometimes I will veil at protests just to sort of protect myself from the energy that we're fighting against. So veiling was sometimes constant, but also sometimes circumstantial. And in fact, in classical Greece, men did veil. Men did also bind their hair, so it's not like an exclusion based on that. So those are the main forms of purification that we've seen. Water, fire, clothes, scapegoats, and just generally preventative. You know, they say the best offense is a good defense. Well, that's very much the case with that. But there's another interesting one that's more intense, was also seen, and this would be ritual defilement. So this is where we see catharsis or catharmos coming into play. Most commonly, it would be smearing of dirt on the body or a refusal of cleanliness. So this is seen in the Iliad, to the death of Patroclus. Achilles refuses ablution as a form of mourning, so he refuses to be clean. That way, when he finally bathes, it is a symbolic breaking of grief and heaviness and a return to normalcy. So again, we see that rite of separation. So some festivals actually require the act of ritual defilement, dirt or blood or other disgusting things. In fact, there's actually a few festivals that involve verbal ritual defilement, where you just kind of go around and insult each other or insult people. I think that's kind of hilarious, and I think we should bring back. And so that way, when it is washed away, the act of cleaning is so much more impressive. One of the most intense forms of ritual defilement is catharsis through blood, or catharmos through blood, specifically pig's blood. It is said that Apollo himself purified Orestes at Delphi using pig's blood. So if you know the story of Orestes, you know that kind of catharsis is not usual. You likely don't need to do this. You don't need to do this, and if you do need to do this, you should probably turn yourself in for a grievous crime. So Orestes killed his mother and his stepfather. That is why Orestes had to be purified in such an intense manner. Again, if you have to be purified in this intense manner, I can't help you. What would happen is the pig, usually a piglet, would be held over their head. The blood would drip down on the head onto the hands, and then it would be wiped away and like changed into new clothes, purified bath, the whole 9 yards. Again, ritual defilement, usually, especially in that case, was reserved only in really extreme cases in which a lot of pollution, in which really nasty pollution needed to be expunged. That was not a routine form of purification. So speaking of routine purification, oftentimes this question is, how much were they engaging in these rituals? So a wonderful discussion happens in Characters by Theophrastus, where there is a man who is just very much like cleaning himself all the time, and it highlights how unusual this was. So this section, again, comes from Miasma by Robert Parker, and it's a good indication to us not only of what purification rituals looked like or what was considered purifying, but also what were the social expectations and when did that teeter out of normal ritual purification into the abnormal. Unless you were a priest, constant ritual purity was not expected to be maintained. And even in the case of priests, that didn't always happen. The superstitious man in Theophrastus' characters begins his day with the ritual washing of his hands and the besprinkling of his body, and puts a piece of laurel wreath in his mouth. He purifies the house on a regular basis, fearing that the goddess Hecate may have taken possession of it by means of some hostile spell. He avoids contact with women in childbed and with death, and avoids even the sight of a tombstone, so as to not contract pollution. When he encounters someone else chewing garlic, he purifies himself and summons priestesses to encircle him with a cathartic squill or poppy. As if all this were not enough, he participates in the Orphic mysteries once a month, entailing further purifactory measures. The superstitious man whose life is dedicated to the desperate attempt to avoid any kind of ritual pollution is a caricature, meant as a criticism as unreasonable superstitions and improper social behavior. This example may serve to illustrate the point that purity and pollution ought to be understood as categories constructed in order to establish a temporary differentiation. For if only a situation prevailed in which every single exposure to corpse, childbirth, or to someone chewing garlic entails ritual pollution, everyday life in the Greek world would be passed with constant religious scruple and ritual purifications, and hence become unbearable. Speaking of the average ancient Greek life, let's talk about the not so average, aka mystery cults and philosophical considerations. The idea of purification and catharsis was later expanded upon by philosophers, notably Plato and Aristotle, and they took it to the realm of the intellectual and the mental. However, he wasn't just sort of pulling ideas out of thin air, he was pulling on those who came in the earlier classical period. This would be namely Pythagoras, Empedocles, and the Orphics. Plato is credited with saying that the impure man is that who is wicked in his soul. A pure man was to be just, courageous, intellectual, and to show self-restraint. And that way, he was not just pure physically, but also pure in mind, body, and spirit. Plato believed that purity was a way of life and would lead to a pure death. This is why he was so adamant about morality and developed his own system of morality, is because he viewed morality as being akin to purity. Like I said, this idea didn't begin with Plato at all. He was credited with ushering this into the more common consciousness, but this idea of philosophical and intellectual purity really comes from the Orphics and the Pythagoreans and somewhat Empedocles. They were very obsessed with purity to the point of almost ridiculousness. For example, Pythagoras forbade his followers from wearing images of the gods in case they came in contact with something impure and just thus would defile them. Pythagoras was said to be almost like the character in Characters by Theophrastus, in which he would avoid death at all costs, or avoid even going near a tombstone. Interestingly enough, Orphics, Pythagoreans, and the followers of Empedocles were usually vegetarians. In fact, they considered eating animals to be akin to cannibalism, and Empedocles specifically wrote extensively about vegetarianism. And this is diametrically opposed to a lot of the ancient Greek world where animal sacrifice was abundant. To them, vegetarianism was a form of purity, and to consume meat was to then make yourself impure. They also had unique forms of purification, so Pythagoras viewed harmony and music as a purification for the soul. I will make a whole video about Pythagoras and music because, long story short, Pythagoras is the reason we have our 7-note scale. Pythagoras is the reason our music is the way it is at all, and it all comes back to it having mystical and divine properties. So, yeah, music, the way that Pythagoras made it, is inherently divine, and that's the same musical system we use today. Again, that's just an aside. I'm going to make a whole video about music and Pythagoras, because I just love it. Plato took this even farther to be all intellectual activity to be purifying. And then Aristotle took it another step further, in which he considered certain forms of art to be cathartic. So in Poetics by Aristotle, he talks about the healing nature of art, specifically theater, and the importance of tragedy. So tragedy in his mind would take us to such low lows, almost akin to ritual defilement, which then when we would express this grief, express these extreme emotions, usually like disgust and shame and sorrow specifically, that we were then purged of these emotions and purged of these feelings, in which we would then be taken to a new heightened level of purity. Very much a metaphorical form of ritual defilement. So in certain mysteries, like the Bacchic mysteries, dancing was also considered to be purifying, or at least to be a part of a purification ritual. So the idea of intellectual or symbolic purity is not just a Platonic or Aristotelian thing. It comes from quite a bit earlier as well. How do we engage in these purification rituals today? quite simply. Again, the types of purity rituals that I listed are water, fire and fumigation, scapegoats, veiling, and intellectual/artistic. Water. Literally just washing your hands. This is what I do for cleansing and purification 9 times out of 10. You can use tap water, spring water, rainwater, seawater, heck, even moon water. Any clean water will do. But as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to get into what I call the great Khernip debate. One of the things you'll come across in your journey with Hellenic polytheism is the word Khernip. Like, I don't think you'll be able to go into a post and not find it. Somewhere, somehow, this idea of taking water, purified water, spring water, seawater, lighting something on fire, and sticking it into the bowl and saying something took off. Lustral water Khernips were a thing. However, how to create them is a matter of archaeological debate. It's not really specified. Even water just drawn from a spring or drawn from the sea could be called lustral water. I went on a deep dive to try to find out where this came from, where this sort of whisper down the alley came from, because when I went on blogs, I was just getting linked back and forth between blogs, and none of them, and I mean none of them, had primary sources listed. And it wasn't until I started really asking around where people either admitted that they didn't know where it came from, or they sent me to one passage in Greek Religion by Walter Burkert. Here it is. There is no consecration of the water, but often it must be drawn from a particular source. Occasionally, the water must be fetched from further afield, from an ever-flowing spring, or from the always powerful sea. The purifying power of fire is joined to the power of water when a log is taken from the altar fire, dipped in water, and used to sprinkle the sanctuary, altar, and participants. However, I will point out nowhere does Burkert say that this is a pan-Hellenic thing, and nowhere is the word that is used, that I've seen on blogs, nowhere is that mentioned. For all we know, this could have been a specific temple and a specific polis. It is also clear that this likely would have been for a certain ritual and was by no means the usual or common manner of purification. This only specification that he makes here is that it must be drawn from a certain source, usually a spring or a sea. In my opinion, Khernip, as this method of creating this lustral water in the way that it's seen in a lot of modern Hellenism, is kind of just a whisper down the alley of this section, and it's not clear what he's talking about or what primary source he's talking about here. Just wash your hands or throw yourself into the sea, and that's fine. So, fire, fumigation, please, whatever you do, do not burn something that you don't know what burning it does. Just because Odysseus cleansed his house with sulfur doesn't mean you should. You shouldn't. Burning bay leaves is an excellent way to accomplish smoke cleansing or any other herbs that you would like to use. It wasn't so much the contents of what they were burning, but the fact that the smoke itself was seen as a purifying factor. If this is where revivalism can come in, if you want to burn a particular herb because of certain folk properties that it's associated with, that's a wonderful way too. Another idea I had, so long story short, I had an essential oil disaster. I hate essential oils. They're so bad for you. Anyway, I had an essential oil disaster. In order to cleanse my room of this overwhelming smell, I actually took a bowl of baking soda and left it out. And it got me thinking. I was like, I wonder if a bowl of baking soda is kind of sitting there, almost acting to purify the air. I wonder if that could be a form of purification. Got me thinking, maybe. This leads me to my next one, scapegoats. So although we are no longer in the habit of sacrificing animals or casting out people we don't like, it doesn't mean that we can't have scapegoats. One of the things that I've done before, during Thargelia, one of the things that I did was draw an ugly picture or a picture of something that I detested, and I destroyed it. I ripped it up and cast it out of my space. You can also drown it, you could burn it, you can build something out of clay and smash it. I've even heard of people making little cookies and burning them. It's actually a very satisfying way of doing scapegoats, and I personally enjoy it quite a bit. It's very, no pun intended, cathartic. Veiling. Obviously, I'm veiling now. Veiling is a wonderful preventative form of cleanliness and purification. The act of veiling separates you from the mundane world. You can do it all the time. I know people who veil all the time. You can also do it ritually. And it can also be sort of devotional to certain deities like Hesiod. It also doesn't have to be anything fancy. Veils at the time could cover just a bit of your head. I mean, binding doesn't really cover your head at all. Could cover your whole head, or even in certain cases it would cover your entire face. But you don't also have to veil. It's an option for you. I tend to veil in a more medieval style or Renaissance style, just because I'm a sucker for fashion in that time period. So intellectual and artistic, dance, theater, music, all at certain points were considered forms of purification. Listen to a sad song and cry it out. Watch a sad film that really gets those emotions going and lets you release them. Play a video game that really gets that out. I mean, I don't know why I'm always advocating for video games on this channel. I feel like that says a lot about me. Write a deeply emotional story. This is also a good stealthy option for cleansing and purification because, you don't want to burn anything or don't want to necessarily take a ritual bath, but except for washing your hands, you should be doing that regardless. But anyway, we're reaching the end of this video, and I hope despite all the chaos of everything I tried to record in this video went freaking wrong. But anyway, I hope I was able to answer some of your questions about purification and cleanliness, how they looked back then, how they look today, and how they sort of changed over time. Also, keep in mind you don't need to purify yourself every 5 seconds. It is the act of setting yourself apart, really, and it doesn't even necessarily need to be on a day-to-day basis. I mean, one of the things I like to do is just every morning when I wash my hands, just sort of mentally calm myself and dedicate it as an act of cleanliness and purification. You don't need to become an ascetic Orphic in order to achieve purity and cleanliness. And you don't need to avoid everything that creates pollution. Humanity is messy, the world is messy, cleanliness is important, like regular hygiene, but it doesn't need to be at the forefront of your mind, like, all the time. But if you have any questions or things you'd like me to answer or like me to address, feel free to pop them in the comments. It can help me see, what people really want to hear about, so feel free to pop those down. If you really want me to do a deep dive on definitions of pollution, I will try. It's a very complicated topic. I also don't have to. But again, thank you so much for everyone's lovely support here. Keep learning, keep growing, keep touching grass, keep breathing, and keep washing your hands. Stay hydrated. Thank you so much, and I will see you in the next one. Bye. Making this video was a nightmare.